Shalom, welcome back. What a pleasure it is to see you all again for this, now our 10th episode of Rabbi Chorny's video logs. Today, I am delighted to welcome to join me, Dr. Stuart Mest, who has become a member of our congregation in the last couple of years and has become quite an invaluable member, joining the board and participating in quite a number of important committees that are now very, very relevant pertaining to our approach to the coronavirus and other committees such as our fundraising and finance committee. Stuart, how are you?
I'm doing well, Rabbi. Thank you.
I know you have transferred back to New Jersey for the summer months. How are you guys faring up there?
Carol and I are doing well. We're at the South Jersey Shore, Ventnor, which is near Atlantic City. We're here most of the time, and then sometimes we have a small condo in Center City, Philadelphia, in the Rittenhouse Square area that we also go to, especially when we want to see the kids.
Wonderful. I'm talking about kids. I have to make the comment that I met them all at your daughter's wedding last year. It was quite a privilege for me to participate in the family simcha, to get to know such wholesome children. You must be very, very proud, and hopefully they'll make you a grandfather soon. We're all hoping, right?
Right.
But as they say, it's all on a need-to-know basis. And when we need to know, particularly you, I'm sure they'll let you know, right?
Of course.
Stuart, thank you for agreeing to sit with me this morning. And as I always do, I'd like to ask you to give us a brief autobiography or a brief account of your family's history. I know for a fact that you are extremely involved in Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust education and related topics due to your family's history. You are a very active volunteer and docent at our museum here in Naples. So why don't you let us all know a little bit how that interest has evolved through the years?
Well, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. They were both from Poland. My father was born and raised in the city of Lodz. And my mother was brought up in a small village in eastern Poland near the Russian border called Tyszówce, which no longer exists. It's near the city of Lublin. My father was a teenager when the World War II commenced. And he vividly recalled the Germans invading Poland and the city of Lodz. And he and his family were moved to the Lodz ghetto and were there for several years. My father worked in a saddle factory, leather factory in the Lodz ghetto, so he was fed a little more. He had a little more food and miraculously survived. He and his brother were then transported to Auschwitz in a cattle car. And on the train tracks, Dr. Joseph Mengele, murdered his brother right before his eyes that day on the train tracks, as there were no identical twins that day. So Dr. Mengele was quite upset about that and said so. And my father survived Auschwitz and was subsequently transferred to Dachau as they started to liquidate Auschwitz because they knew the Russians were coming. And then he worked in a satellite camp at Dachau in a lime quarry and managed to survive miraculously, developed typhus at the end of the war, was delirious when the American soldiers liberated Dachau, and recalls faintly the liberation. He was hospitalized in a makeshift hospital outside of Dachau. The Americans put up a makeshift hospital, and he survived that, and subsequently was taken to Camp Feldafing, which was a displaced persons camp, where he was for over 4 years, because the world, even after the Holocaust, didn't want immigrants and didn't want Jews. And it took quite a while for him to emigrate. He applied to Palestine, Australia, you name it. And finally, a distant family member sponsored him and brought him to the United States in 1949. My mother was 6 years old when when the World War II started. She was the youngest child of a large family. She vividly recalled the Nazis coming into their small village, wearing the Jewish star. Her father died at the beginning of the war. Her older siblings escaped into Russia. She and her mother starved in the ghetto there. And her mother got very sick and told her, you have to go save yourself. So at 8 years old, she managed to escape from the ghetto and lived in the forest areas, living in what they called deep bunkers as a child, learning how to survive with the partisans, making pretend she wasn't Jewish. And she got taken in by a few families briefly, but then figured she was a Jewish kid and they would try to sell her for a 5-pound bag of sugar because that was the going rate if you turned into a Jewish child. Then she managed to escape, was shot once. The bullet grazed her left shoulder. I always saw that wound, that skin mark where she was shot. And she was taken in by a family the last 6 months of the war as she was emaciated and near death. And they took her in until the war was over, fed her and clothed her. She went to church every Sunday with them because she said she was Catholic. And they protected her till the end of the war. And at the end of the war, she told them who she was. And they weren't really surprised. And she tried to go back to her village, and there was nobody left. And she was taken by the American soldiers. And she was, at the end of the war, she was 13 years old, still a child, but an adult. And she went to a displaced persons camp in Bamberg, Germany. And she met one of her older siblings who survived in Russia. And she too was in a displaced persons camp for over 4 years, because even though an uncle in America had already started the paperwork to bring her over because of what was going on in America after World War II, she did not come over also till 1949. So I am the product of 2 Holocaust survivors who shaped, and I was shaped by watching them, how they behaved, how they interacted, how kind and generous they were. And they truly shaped who I was and who my older brother is.
And how is that? What experiences shaped you?
Well, my parents, unlike other Holocaust survivors, did tell us what they went through for a number of reasons, one of which was we understood how overprotective they were of us because they lost everybody there, practically, all family. And so they were very protective of us, but they made sure that we understood how important it was to be kind, generous, loving. If my parents we were driving down the Roosevelt Boulevard in Northeast Philadelphia, for those who are familiar with that, if my father saw a homeless person, he would stop the car and go out, and my mother and he would say if there was anything they could do for them. Because when they were starving to death, being persecuted, no one looked after them. No one spoke. So they always said that we must always look out for our fellow citizen, for our fellow human being, for our fellow Jew, and to make sure that the Holocaust never happened. So they wanted us to remember, to allow it never to happen again. And so they taught us about what it meant to be a Jew in many aspects other than just religious. And they truly shaped how we approached it. Because I remember when I was younger, I came home from school and I said something to my mother that I can't do this or I couldn't do something. And she said, no, you never say that. You won't do it. There is nothing you can't do. You put your mind to it. She gave an example. If they told you to walk over hot coals, you take your shoes and socks off, you walk across the hot coals, you put your shoes and socks back on, You never show pain. You never show that it hurt you. You keep your head high and you keep walking. You can accomplish anything you have to. That's how the mentality of a survivor.
Of course.
So this is what my parents taught us, that you push and you go forward. You never look back.
Well, most of us, having been raised, of course, as baby boomers, barely were weaned at age 8. These folks were already old souls. Life had beaten them up. And of course, what you transcribe in now for us is a very vivid example. I have to confess, my parents and grandparents were not that close to the Holocaust, but growing up in Colombia among survivors, I experienced some of that. My grandparents, who were German Jews, of course, gravitated to other Germans. And on Saturdays, when they had their famous Kaffee und Kuchen, that was the subject. I spoke German before I spoke Spanish. So deep down, all of these experiences also are embedded in my heart. And I feel for you. But more importantly, I thank you for being open and prepared to share them with us, as you do in so many different ways. And I thank you for that. Why Philadelphia? Tell me why they settled in Philadelphia.
Well, my parents came independently and settled in Brooklyn. In the DP camps, they had education, as you know, schooling. My father actually had the equivalent of a CDL license because the American Army taught him how to drive big rigs and trucks in Camp Feldefink. So when he came over, he already started working as a delivery man in Brooklyn. He always loved to say his first day in America, he showed up at work. You know, they both came to America and the next day they both went to work.
Unbelievable.
Yes. And because they had to support themselves, to feed themselves. And my father walked into a shop and the gentleman who was the shopkeeper, because his people who brought him over, his distant cousins, arranged for him to have a job. And he said, here are your deliveries. Here's a map of Brooklyn. These are your deliveries today. My father said, I don't know if I can do this. This is my second day in America. And the gentleman looked at him and said, you survived the Lodz Ghetto. You survived Auschwitz. You survived Dachau. You survived typhus and other infections. You were in a displaced persons camp for 4 years. I think you'll figure this out.
And of course he did.
He did. He said he made every delivery before midnight that day and then went back to work. But they both wanted to get their high school equivalent degree. So they met in night school in New York, in Brooklyn. And my father pursued my mother, as she would say. She kept telling him no. She didn't want to go out on a date with him, but he persisted. And so she finally said yes.
They were both in their 20s now.
Yeah. Well, my mother was late 18, 19, and he was in his 20s. And they went out and subsequently got engaged, got married, settled in Brooklyn. My older brother was born actually in Brooklyn. They then moved to Philadelphia because my father thought there was more opportunity. They initially lived in South Philadelphia, where a lot of Jewish people were living at that time. And then they migrated to the northeast section of Philadelphia, and that's where I was.
Did he ever use his leather working experience? No.
He actually worked for a company, Saxony sportswear company, that did importing of leather goods, actually. So but in a way,
manufacturing.
No, it came around. And then he also operated a stand at a farmer's market selling men's clothing. And so he had 2 jobs, actually, to support us.
Correct.
Put a roof over our head and shoes on our feet.
Now, did they bring the language with them from the DP camps? Did they know a little English?
They learned English in the DP camps. My parents spoke many languages they had learned. In the house, they spoke to us in Yiddish, but we had to answer in English. So when we went to school, we could speak English. They always spoke to us in Yiddish. When they didn't want us to understand what was going on, they spoke in Polish.
Polish, right. So obviously, Philadelphia is your home, and you went to high school there. Tell me a little bit about your own development. Of course, you're a physician. Tell me about yourself.
I graduated from Northeast High School, and in high school, I still was thinking about what I wanted to do professionally. I couldn't decide between pursuing a medical career and becoming a rabbi. Actually,
Good
I
for
never
you.
didn't do that. And towards the end of 10th grade, I decided I wanted to pursue a medical career. And I applied to college. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, graduated from there, and then went to Penn State College of Medicine. Then I did my internship and residency in internal medicine at Pennsylvania Hospital, the nation's first hospital, which is located in downtown Philadelphia. And then I did a pulmonary critical care fellowship at Temple University and its affiliates. And Carol and I had already been married, and we were living in Center City, Philadelphia. And then I started looking for jobs in pulmonary and critical care medicine. And it brought us to South Jersey, where I joined a multi-specialty medical group. And we had moved and bought a home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where we lived for nearly 10 years. And then we moved to Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which was a few towns over, closer to our work. And we lived there for nearly 25 years till we sold our home a few years ago. And that brought us to Naples, actually.
How did the practice of medicine evolve during your career? I have to remind some of our viewers, I don't know if you would like me to say this or not, but you made a very conscious decision to retire, what some people would say quite early. At least I was very impressed by the fact, not positive or negative, but I was impacted by the fact that you made a very conscious decision. I know Carol is also a medical practitioner. She's a nurse with a specialty in wound care, correct?
She's a clinical nurse practitioner, adult medicine, and then she specialized in diabetes care and wound care and certified in both, actually.
Right.
And we worked hard our professional careers, never really traveled, made sure everything was there for the kids. They went to summer camp, Camp Ramah, overnight camp, things like that. But we never really took vacations. So we always thought that we would hopefully retire early and enjoy our retirement. So when we still physically could, but we both saw the landscape of medicine. And boy, how drastically it changed over the 30 plus years that we were both in it. We were trained to practice medicine. And towards the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, as my patients were asking why I was frustrated and then subsequently going to leave the practice, is that I said we weren't practicing medicine anymore. We were forced to deliver healthcare. And those are two, from our standpoint, opposite ends of the spectrum. We were trained to practice medicine, but because of governmental and insurance company and other outside influences, now medicine, you're delivering healthcare. You're no longer allowed to practice medicine. So actually, it became foreign to us. We were very frustrated. I know I was. And the patients, they themselves are frustrated because of what they see the practice of medicine has turned into. Now, recent graduates from medical school and training programs don't know any different because this is what they're used to. But for someone who went to medical school 30, 40, 50 years ago and were trained by esteemed physicians, this is not what we were taught to do. So we both said it's time to leave the practice of medicine, and we did.
Well, that's a gain for us, and particularly the fact that you chose Naples to join us and share with us who you are. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, as a pulmonary specialist, to tell us a little bit about your impressions of the current situation. Is the change in medical approach that you've just described made it better or worse at the way we are managing the coronavirus? Where do you see had you stayed in practice today?
Um, what is shocking to us as medical professionals is the doctors and the nurses, and all the healthcare workers are doing the best they can. The fact that we, from a national standpoint, and I've talked to my fellow physicians who I practice with, and some older than I am, we're all just amazed and shocked by, from a federal government standpoint, how ill prepared we were for a pandemic, even though there have been warning signs in the past. And in fact, a physician in the Air Force about 2000, in the mid 2000s, had conducted a study about pandemic, whether it's a biological attack, biological weapons, etc., that we were totally unprepared in terms of personal protective equipment, things like that from the federal standpoint, local state government standpoint, and hospital standpoint, administrative standpoint, in terms of securing the necessary equipment and having it on hand to treat such a pandemic. And I hope, and I think we will, there'll be a root cause analysis when this is all said and done at the federal government level, the state government level, as well as the individual hospital chains, to be better prepared the next time around, because there will be another biological infectious pandemic, because that's just the natural history.
I don't think you have to be a scientist or a very educated person to realize that as the world shrinks because of high-speed transportation and the borders are so thin, that this has to happen again as populations mix and coexist across borders. Any regrets having left medicine? I don't detect so.
No, I still keep in contact with a lot of my patients. They call me, ask how I'm doing. They're seeing my partners, and no, we have no regrets. As Good. I said, we knew in our inner self it was time to step away.
Right.
And it became so frustrating to go to work every day. I loved practice of medicine. The profession is one of the most noble professions ever to be. And what has happened to it, I can't even describe and put into words.
Well, I know you're heartbroken because you and I have had privately this conversation. I do know that. I also know the fact that all of these insurance companies and all of the administrative complications basically just frustrated you in the delivery of medicine as you were trained to do. Very nice. Okay. So how are you focusing your energy these days? It's not just traveling and fun and games. No. I know you guys are productive and apply yourselves in many different arenas. I know here in Naples for sure. Tell me a little bit how you have transitioned to this new life.
Well, it's interesting. When we first came down to Naples, 2011, I was there on a conference, and we took a drive through town, and I said, did I just see what I saw? A sign? There's a Holocaust museum in Naples, Florida. I said, wow. And we investigated that, and I went and took a tour back then. And I said, wow, someday when we retire, that's where I'm going to go. And that's what I've done since we've been in Naples, 7-8 months a year. I spend a lot of time at the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center doing tours, mostly with the students, because as you know, most 8th graders in Collier County and Southern Lee County come to the museum for an abbreviated tour and an educational program, and we teach the lessons of the Holocaust. And as our mission statement is, to teach the lessons of the Holocaust to inspire action against hatred, bigotry, and violence. Correct. And that's what me and Carol spends a lot of time also at the museum, and that's what we've dedicated a large part of our lives to do. Because if you ask any Holocaust survivor, that's what they would ask of us.
That we do right.
That we do right. And it's as a child of survivors, and as you know, most Holocaust survivors have passed on, it's incumbent on us, our second generation, the 2Gs as are called. We now need to take up the mantle and continue the education. the education process.
I neglected to ask you, was Carol's history similar?
No, her parents were not survivors. No, her father was in the military, and he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy Reserves, fought in World War II, part of the greatest generation. And her mother's, but his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents have been in America for quite some time in the Massachusetts area. And her mother's family came over from Latvia, Lithuania, that area, settled in upstate New York, and then they subsequently moved to Philadelphia area because he worked for General Electric. And the plant in Schenectady, New York, was closing down, and there's a large GE facility there was in Philadelphia, and that's why her parents moved to the Philly area.
I know there is a hidden gem in your father-in-law's background when it came to General Electric that for the most of his life he never spoke about. But a few days back, we had a minyan to remember him. And I remember hearing a little bit about some contributions that he's made. Would you share that with those who are listening?
Oh, sure. He was an amazing guy, very intelligent. He graduated Union College in 1942. He didn't go for it. It took him like 2 years or 3 years to graduate, I believe. Joined the military, as did his two siblings. So they were all fighting during World War II in the Navy. And his older brother got shot down over the Pacific, was a prisoner of war in Japan, and died as a Japanese POW. He survived the war, came back to America, then went to MIT, got his master's degree in electrical engineering through the government, GI program. Yeah, and then went and worked for GE and never really talked much about what he did there. He retired in his 60s, and then after he passed away, his kids went through his papers, and we saw that in the 50s, when he was working for GE, and in the 60s, he worked on radar for submarines to detect mines and things like that. And he was credited for all these discoveries by GE, patents that were created because of his work, that obviously GE owns. Because he worked for GE, and all these things that he never, ever spoke about.
Wow.
This top secret work that he did all those years for GE and for the military. Now,
did you meet them? Were they still alive? Did your kids have a relationship with their grandparents?
Yeah. My mother passed away. She was very young at age 55, right after Shana was born, our oldest. Shana was 3 months old when she passed away. But so they never really met my mother. My father, yes, all three of the kids knew my father, but he passed away also at a young age. He was 72. Mason and Ruth, Carol's parents, lived substantially longer, and all three grandkids knew them very, very, very well. Their grandfather Mason passed away, about 12 years ago. And Ruth passed away about 5 years ago. So, they were very close to their maternal grandparents.
So how would you say the amalgamation of these two family histories, so very different, materializes or reflects itself in your children, in that generation that is now taking the banner forward?
Well, both sides of the family very much identified with their Judaism, from a religious standpoint to a certain degree, but a cultural standpoint, a historical standpoint, and all three kids know who they are. And, as my parents said to me as I was growing up, and I had repeatedly said to our kids, you have to know where you came from to know where you're going.
Beautiful. My mother that is actually
over and over again. And that's what we have said to them over and over again. Because too many people in this world are lost. They have no compass as to where they need to go. But our kids know where they came from. They know their history.
Right.
And so hopefully that puts them on the right path going forward. I think it has.
Yeah. The Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah tells us precisely that in Hebrew. Da minayin ata ba, know from whence you come, ve'le'an ata olech, and where you are going to. So knowing where you come from provides direction for where you're going to. It's absolutely true. And our rabbis put it in writing 2,000 years ago, providing us, as you very, very properly said, a compass, not only for individual life, but for communal life as well.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah. I am delighted that you gave me the opportunity to learn more about you, as well as all those who are going to watch this. What would you let us go with today on the 17th of Tammuz? As you know, it is a fast day, anticipating the beginning of the 3 weeks to Tisha B'Av, which until the last century was considered the greatest calamity, the greatest a catastrophe that ever happened to the Jews. There are a lot of conflicts these days as to whether we should be fasting on Tisha B'Av because we have a state of Israel that is now flourishing. So some people say we should still fast on Tisha B'Av, if anything, for the calamities of the Holocaust, and remember them. So I have all of these ideas and very, very deep feelings brewing in my mind and my heart. What would you give me to let me go today before we sign out?
We shouldn't be silent. Silence only enables the oppressor. Those were some of Elie Wiesel's famous words. And as you know, he was a Holocaust survivor, Nobel laureate in literature. And we as a people need not to be silent. We need to remember our past, the persecution that we endured, the suffering that we endured. We cannot allow that to happen to ourselves, our fellow Jewish people, but to any group of people. We cannot allow intolerance, bigotry, hatred, violence to continue. Those are the lessons of the Holocaust.
Correct.
We need to make sure we continue to preach those lessons.
I hope that those words echo far and wide, particularly on these days of Black Lives Matter. I'm not prepared to make comparisons between victims of the Holocaust, etc., etc. But as you say, we as Jews have an obligation, a moral imperative to speak up on behalf of those who are lacking the most fundamental values or equality. And we should all be prepared to follow your father's example and stop in the middle of the road, stop whatever we're doing at any given time and speak up, lend a hand, and try to better the condition of our fellow human beings. Well, Stuart, I thank you. It has been most enlightening and pleasurable to have this time with you. I look forward to seeing you back in Naples soon. And hopefully by then, not only will we shake hands, but I'll be able to give you a big hug, as I am craving to be able to do to all my congregants who I miss so very much.
Amen.
Thank you, Stuart. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.